like to welcome all of you today to our first lunchtime seminar of the academic year. I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And I'm truly delighted to be able to introduce our speaker today, Valentina Pisanty, teaches semiotics at the University of Bergamo. She's published articles and essays on Holocaust denial, racism, political discourse analysis, narratology, humor, interpretive semiotics, the rhetoric of memory making, and the semiotics of testimony. Her most recent book in English translation is The Guardians of Memory and the Return of the Xenophobic Right, which is closely related to her title today, which is The Politics of Memory and the Return of the Xenophobic Right. Valentina will speak for about half an hour, and then after she's spoken, we'll open the session up to questions and discussion. If you have a question, please raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you to unmute. If you prefer to put a comment or a question in the chat, that's also is also possible. I'll just add before we start that Valentina and I have a mutual friend, and when I said to him that Valentina is I'm speaking at the Institute today, he was thrilled. He said, she is a magnificent intellectual, and then went on and said many other extremely positive things. So it's with a great expectation and anticipation that I invite Valentina to speak about the politics of memory and the return of the xenophobic right. Valentina.
So thank you very much, David, for this great introduction. I hope I'll be up to it. So the starting point of my talk is the acknowledgement that the politics of memory have failed. Over the last 30 years, the victim-centered memory of the Shoah has filled the void that was left by the crisis of the great revolutionary narratives and utopias of the 20th century. Utopias that conversely told the story of the heroic quest for emancipation of the oppressed against their oppressors. As it became hegemonic, the Holocaust narrative sidelined the revolutionary paradigm and found its way into the heart of Western consciousness as a cautionary tale of the catastrophes from whose ashes post-war Europe arose. But what transnational identity can derive its values from the solemn promise, never again? An identity that denies conflict as one of the primary constitutive possible human relationships. Indeed, it is not always clear what never again refers to anti-Semitism or to the persecution of any stigmatized minority, to extermination on an industrial scale, or to any other form of discrimination. Be it as it may, the simplistic equation, never forget equals never again, has become so deeply rooted that very few people consider questioning it, despite the abundance of counter-evidence, the upsurge of racist violence, parades with fascist symbols, the spread of hatred on and offline, xenophobic parties in power, and now even war. Now, why are we so reluctant to admit that something has gone wrong? The unwillingness to admit the failure of the politics of memory is, I think, symptomatic of a principle of dogmatic anti-liberal thinking that has insinuated itself into the folds of commemorative rhetoric, often unbeknownst to those who practice it. Those who identify with democratic views are used to associating authoritarianism with the far right, where the appeal to indisputable dogmas is customary. But a subtler form of dogmatism also lurks in the ways in which, through the politics of memory, today's liberal democracies legitimize themselves in the eye of public opinion. The paradox is that the memory of the Shoah, elected as the supreme symbol of democratic values, is often promoted through devices that we could define as authoritarian. And I shall be talking about 4 of them. The first is the sacralization of witness testimony as the only kind of authoritative discourse. 2, the privatization of history as an asset to be spent on the public stage. 3, the appropriation of the language of the Holocaust by those interested in cloaking their partisan arguments with universality. 4, the political use of criminal law as a shield against Holocaust deniers and other thugs of memory. So let's start with the first one, the sacralization of witness testimony. Ever since survivors of the camps have been vested with a novel exemplary function by a culture more and more inclined to see the memory of the Shoah as its moral barycenter, witnesses have found themselves performing a task that goes beyond the normal transmission of knowledge that ensures the continuity of every culture. This is revealed with some embarrassment by historians who, often finding themselves speaking alongside witnesses during official commemorations, feel unable to publicly correct any factual errors, presumably caused by lapses of memory, false recollections, cultural interferences, and so on. Survivors are always right, even when they are manifestly wrong. A case in point, in an interview of April 2008, Vera Belmont, director of the movie Surviving with Wolves, based on Misha de Fonseca's false Holocaust memoir, said, quote, "I talked with Simone Weil about my film, and she told me that it doesn't matter if the story is real or sham. The important thing is the message it conveys, the value it gives to memory. The most important thing is that the audience can identify with the story." Now, with few exceptions, the witnesses themselves take pains to avoid claiming this kind of privilege. See, for example, Primo Levi in The Drowned and the Saved. So my criticism is not really aimed at them. It was the others, the institutions, the media, us, who attributed an almost religious value to their words, as if the fact of having been there in the sites of trauma protected them from any attempt at refutation. The overall result, however, is a gradual but inexorable delegitimization of the scientific historical method as a principle for the selection of the most suitable narratives. Its place is taken by a principle of authority. I believe this because he or she said so, which discourages any further inquiry into the credibility of the testimony and the lessons that may be drawn from it. Non-witnesses who wish to perform the duty of memory are expected to empathize with the suffering of the victims to the point of total identification with their claims, past and present. We are all Anne Frank or whoever stands in that enunciative position. What are the consequences of this symbolic shift? In a prevalently narrative truth regime based on the dogma of witness infallibility, very few people outside the specialized community feel the need to interpret historical events according to the verifiable criteria, the publicly shared rules of the game that scientific research is supposed to abide by. Rather, everyone has blind faith in the narrator to whom they have delegated the quasi-divinatory capacity to tell truth from falsehood. In the long run, the community unlearns how to make judicious application of its own skepticism, and the only stories worthy of trust are those that confirm beliefs fixed a priori from their own sources of reference, whereas the accounts of the others are automatically held to be false. It is no accident that naive credulousness keeps step with the popularity of the most disparate conspiracy theories. Hence, the mandate accorded to the guardians of memory By this, I mean people, associations, institutions who speak in the name of the victims, witnesses of witnesses. They draw legitimacy from a kind of osmotic contact with those who were there. The guardians protect the symbolic patrimony from undesirable incursions and violations to make sure that outsiders do not cross the threshold of the sanctuary. They establish who may invoke the memory of the dead in support of their own cause by authorizing pertinent comparisons while sanctioning the inadmissibility of all other uses of memory. This was very clear, for example, during the war in the ex-Yugoslavia, when all the groups involved in the multilateral conflict framed their territorial claims in terms of Holocaust-like victimization. Such analogies definitely didn't help understand, let alone solve, the complexities of that conflict. But several appointed Western guardians took it on them to establish who were the Nazis and who were the Jews. It was okay to compare Milosevic to Hitler, less so to extend the comparison to the Croatian nationalists, for example. Now, it is natural for people to feel the need for such guardians in a context of unbridled competition between particular narratives that aspire to universal recognition, in the absence of another independent, albeit ideal, place to which they may refer to assess the relative credibility of each one. But the price of this substitution is very high. The charismatic authority of the guardians stands in for the enlightened project of a widespread critical awareness, the main guarantor of which is, or should be, correct argumentation. It shouldn't come as a surprise, therefore, if at a certain point, the same principle of authority is brandished by those who, with greater historical coherence, use it to promote their own interests by any means necessary. America first, Italy for the Italians, Hungary for the Hungarians, Ukraine as the cradle of Russia, etc., etc. So here we reach the second point, the privatization of history. The aporias of so-called cosmopolitan memory lurk in the contrast between the presumed universality of the core narrative and the inevitable specificity of the uses that are made of it. Memory simply can't be universal. It is always instrumental to the interests and sensibilities of whoever controls its formats in that moment. One of the distinctive features of memory is the fact that it always belongs to someone who considers it as a personal emanation and therefore feels that he or she can do whatever he wants with it. This is why even when someone recollects an event poorly, calling up non-existent details or omitting disturbing elements and so on, no one can ever dispossess them of that memory, imperfect as it may be. I could be wrong, but this is what I remember. My memories are mine, they belong to me. Now, while a person's full ownership is indisputable in the case of individual memory, matters get a little more complicated in relation to the so-called collective memory. To speak of our memory implies that all individuals who we refer to as us share the same representation of the past. Reaching a suitable agreement about recent events is in itself a difficult task. Who decides which episodes are to be included or omitted? Which details deserve emphasis? Which relations of cause and effect should be established? Which interpretations called for, and which points of view favored? And especially, who has the last word should the versions not correspond? Obviously, things get even more difficult when the events in question refer to a distant past. What gets sacrificed when the past is framed exclusively in terms of memory is the public nature of history. The problem is not so much establishing how things really went, nor in how many different ways the same events lend themselves to being told. Rather, it's a question of claiming the rights, the priority of one's point of view in relation to those events. There is a perspective that automatically prevails over the others. The heritage to be preserved is the inalienable memory of an emotionally loaded experience that no historical reconstruction can ever empty of its subjective contents. And this is the problem. Whereas the crux of every universal discourse is this holds good for everyone, the point of every identitary discourse is I alone have experienced this and no one else will ever know how it feels like to be me. Now, combine the two concepts and you produce a strange chimera. I alone have experienced this and therefore it holds good for everyone. In other words, precisely because my experience or that of my group is mine and mine alone, precisely because I hold sole rights to my or our memory, the particular claims that I put forward on the basis of that experience and that memory should be universally acknowledged. One cannot escape from this contradiction, as shown by the endless disputes surrounding the ownership and control of memory, and each country has its own. Point 3, appropriation of the Holocaust lexicon to cloak one's partisan arguments with universality. Now, today we are accustomed to considering the memory of the Jewish genocide as a milestone in European consciousness, so accustomed indeed that most people are surprised when you remind them that the Europeanization of the Holocaust is a fairly recent phenomenon. The process began in the 1990s, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, as formerly communist countries gradually came within NATO's sphere of influence and asked to join the European Union. As Tony Judd famously said, recognition of the Holocaust became the contemporary European entry ticket for states aspiring to Western recognition. The policymakers' reasoning at the time was simple, too simple, in fact. Given that identity is a narrative construct, and given that so-called national identities are also the result of planned processes of storytelling, why not act in concert to break the container of national memories and disseminating, using the conspicuous tools of global communication, a narrative that is abstract and deterritorialized enough to combine the worthiest parts of Europe in search of an identity. A Europe as the paladin of human rights that, along the lines of the American dream, would be multi-ethnic, tolerant, and welcoming. Now, on closer inspection, the memory of the Holocaust and more in general of 20th century totalitarian violence also served another purpose. It illustrated the triumph of liberalism, seen as the light at the end of the tunnel and the ultimate end of history, after which there was no point asking whether there were any alternatives. In fact, the idea of building a post-ideological, would-be universal victim-centered narrative was perfectly compatible with the support of neoliberal market economy on the one hand and the protection of human rights on the other, championed by the theorists of the third way. What hadn't been foreseen was, among other things, the extreme adaptability of the Holocaust narrative to the use that various nations would make of it with regard to their own specific self-narratives, to celebrate the nation arisen from the ashes, Israel, to dissociate themselves from the worst phases of the genocide, Italy and France, to extol their role as liberators, the UK and the United States, etc., etc. With the arrival of former communist countries within the European sphere of influence, the dominant narrative was further adjusted. The cosmopolitan model devised to gather the old continent around a sole anti-totalitarian memory paradoxically encouraged a multiplication of local memories, each aimed at emphasizing the episodes that made the victimization of their specific community stand out more, while nonetheless maintaining the calque of the Holocaust as a rhetorical narrative frame of reference. For example, starting from the 80s and 90s, the memory of the great Ukrainian famine of 1929 and 1933 was framed as a crime against humanity on account of the role played by the Soviet Union and Stalin in causing the conditions that led to the death of several million people from starvation. But the legitimate call for recognition was sometimes accompanied by a far more debatable conspiracist interpretation regarding the reason and the reasons for the world's indifference to the Ukrainian disaster, the same background that had inspired numerous pogroms and the collaboration with the Nazi between 1941 and 1944, and that no later than January 2019 led the parliament in Kiev to declare a day of commemoration and celebration of the deeds of Stepan Bandera. The nationalist propaganda of the 1990s not only denied or minimized the historical acts of violence against Jews perpetrated in Ukraine, but in some cases, it revived the worst anti-Semitic stereotypes to blame Zionist Jews identified with the Bolsheviks, both for the famine of 1932-33 and its blameworthy deletion from the collective memory. At this point, we have moved to another type of appropriation, the exploitation of the Holocaust as an empty narrative form in which anyone, even anti-Semites, can take up residence and portray themselves in the role of victims, as such deserving of indemnities and special immunity. It is not solely a matter of claiming historical wrongs suffered as a cause for identitary pride and considering memory as a useful instrument in the pursuit of political aims that are legitimate per se, the survival of a state, the regeneration of a community, the emancipation of an oppressed group. In some cases, recourse to the victimary narrative serves to cover projects of hegemonic self-affirmation, aggressive sovereignty, and the suppression of dissent. And we arrive, therefore, to the fourth point, the political use of criminal law in most European countries, not in the UK, I don't think. Speaking of the suppression of dissent, the aspect in which the authoritarian drifts of the policies of memory are most evident is that relating to anti-denial laws in force in Europe since the 1990s. For several years now, many historians have contested this interference of politics in fields that should not belong to it. This has not prevented the promulgation of the European Framework Law of 2008, which recommends that all member states of the Union have laws that criminalize the denial and gross minimization of Nazi, fascist, and by extension, communist crimes. Not only do anti-negationist laws clash with the fundamental liberal value of freedom of expression, but they also run the risk of producing diametrically opposite effects to the ones they pursue, insofar as they allow the deniers to portray themselves as martyrs of democracy. Holocaust deniers rehabilitate the people who burned books while crying, "Ideas must not be censored." This is the paradox of contemporary negationism, but this paradox works in conjunction with an opposite yet specular paradox, the idea of combating the revival of Nazi beliefs through censorship. One exemplary case is the so-called Garodi affair. After Roger Garodi, in November 1995, Roger Garodi, who's a former communist converted to Catholicism first and then Islam, published a thinly veiled negationist work in which he maintained that the state of Israel had exploited the so-called myth of the Holocaust to legitimize its expansionist policies. Obviously, the French press raised the controversy, and in accordance with the Guesso law, Garodi was sent to trial. In the meantime, it was announced that the Venerable Abbé Pierre, who had been voted that same year as France's best-loved public figure, supported Garodi on trust, even though he hadn't read his work. Abbé Pierre's declaration caused a considerable sensation, leading to the usual emphatic stance on the right of free speech that, needless to say, the negationists immediately exploited. Garodi's pamphlet was then published in Egypt and reviewed enthusiastically by several Arab newspapers, and Garodi himself was given a triumphal welcome in Damascus, in Amman, in Beirut, and in Tehran. Surfing the wave of his success, other Holocaust deniers made contact with Middle Eastern countries where, untrammeled by any need to make their discourses seem neutral, they were free to adopt openly anti-Semitic tones and positions. And this is how negationism took root in the Middle East and was put to the service of the most virulent anti-Zionist propaganda. So one last personal comment about punitive memory laws. These laws may be framed, according to me, within a growing tendency to limit freedom of expression, in other words, to multiply crimes of opinion in the name of other democratic values, such as security, law and order, and the safeguarding of collective identities. From this standpoint, anti-negationist laws may be compared to anti-terrorist legislation, for example, the law on cyber surveillance that was passed in France in 2014, or the First Amendment on terrorist offenses introduced in the Spanish Penal Code to criminalize the apology for terrorism as well as the terrorist act itself. More and more inclined to blur the boundaries between violent conduct and propaganda in its favor, the legal measures taken to oppose hate speech flatten the distinction between saying and doing, words and actions, genocidal violence and its justification. Now, it may well be that the deniers, if they could, would turn into thugs and torturers of Jews in the flesh. But within the perimeter of the system that we consider democratic, a virtual crime must show other signs of wanting to become real before the state is authorized to step in and nip it in the bud. Otherwise, we are dangerously close to the world of Minority Report. And this is where punitive memory laws reveal their darkest implications. Are we really sure that the struggle against racism is the principal objective of those who support this kind of legislation? Or, as many have suggested, could it also be regarded as an educational tool used to preserve consensus, to mold and reinforce collective identities, to emphasize internal cohesion even when there is none? Whatever we are not terrorists and we are not Holocaust deniers. To shift internal conflict towards the exterior, because what do terrorists and negationists have in common, if not the fact of being beyond redemption, the kind of people that you don't talk to out of principle, and possibly to pave the way for the criminalization of other forms of dissent, to curtail public discussion on certain sensitive issues. That memory laws lend themselves to a drift towards authoritarianism is shown by the uses made of them in many countries, in which the crime of negationism doesn't only extend to a steadily growing range of genocides and other historical crimes, but also affects the way in which those events are classified, interpreted, and narrated. For example, the Czech law of 2009 includes casting doubt on Nazi and communist crimes among the positions that are liable to prosecution. The Lithuanian law of 2010 publishes the negation and the trivialization of the crimes committed by the Soviets during the independence struggle of 1990-1991. The Slovenian law of 2011 extends sanctions to deriding an indefinite range of genocides, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other crimes of aggression. And the Polish law of 2018 penalizes anyone accusing the Polish people of complicity with Nazi crimes. Now, how far can the tendency to remove a theory, no matter how authoritative, from the sphere of dialectics actually go? Could the crime of negationism one day be applied to the negation or doubting of other scientific truths, such as the efficacy of vaccines, the effects of coronavirus, or global warming, or whatever? Once the precedent has been set, the crime of negationism could serve the most disparate interests, not necessarily in line with science, provided they have the backing of whatever political majority happens to be in control at the time. This is where a disconcerting hypothesis looms on the horizon. The onset of new forms of racism have not come about despite the so-called shield of memory. Remorseless insistence on the duty of memory has partaken of the same cultural climate and perhaps has unwittingly encouraged it, therefore in contributing to the rise of the new waves of xenophobia. I'm not talking about a direct cause and effect link, by the way, but I have the feeling that there is a shared mindset, a shared cultural background. This bouleversement was implicit in the premises, namely in the pretensions to endorse the ultimate values of democracy through the use of subtly authoritarian methods that I have been talking about in this talk. So I'd like to finish off with a quote from a friend, Eric Heinze, who teaches law and humanities in London, which I think sums up my argument rather neatly. He wrote, "When an abrupt shut your mouth follows from the spirit of Holocaust commemoration, then something has gone wrong." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentina. I'll just remind people to raise their hand virtually if they have a question, or to put their remarks in the chat, and I'll try to find them there. To start us off, Valentina, that was a hugely rich and provocative paper. I think I'll start off by responding with a rather bland question, which is to say that I think, in a sense, what you presented was in a spirit of a diagnosis of where we are now. But at the same time, there were moments where you sort of spoke about change through time. And in particular, you spoke about the impact of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and you built on Tony Jutt's remarks about the consequences of that. So, building on that, I'd like to ask you if you see sort of all four of the processes that you've examined happening all at once, or do they have, so in that sense, have they always been part of a whole, or are they part of a whole because that's how we apprehend them now, but they have come into place according to different chronologies at different temporalities?
Now, this is a difficult question, and nobody ever asked me that before. I never thought about it that way. So let me try to work it out.
You should speak to historians more often, Valentina.
Yes, yes. Okay, so I feel that, okay, the great threshold, the processes I've been talking about began before the fall of the Berlin Wall, before the Europeanization of Holocaust memory, because it was, I think, the threshold dates are obviously the Eichmann trial, as far as witness testimony is concerned. The sacralization and fetishization of witness testimony began, as Annette Geborka explained, with the Eichmann trial. But then the other threshold date, according to me, is 1978, the Americanization through the miniseries Holocaust, whose huge impact on American and European culture has been very often underlined. And this probably was the beginning of the idea of the Holocaust as a polyvalent metaphor that could be used for other purposes as well. And then the whole thing sort of came together when, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the political agenda was clearer in Europe as well. The idea of what purposes could that memory have. And I do feel that the primary purpose was not fighting racism and anti-Semitism, but creating a narrative strong enough to replace the absence of political projects that could keep Europe together and create that sense of a European identity. So yes, perhaps it would be possible to put them, one after the other, and it might be that the 4 points that I made actually do follow a kind of chronology, one after the other, because I do feel it all starts in a way with the different role that witnesses acquired from a certain point onwards, and then the idea that the Holocaust could become a kind of meta-historical narrative that others should identify with, obviously from the point of view of the victims, and therefore that all those phenomena that many people have talked about, the competition of victimhood, various victims, and whatever that started before the 1990s. The political use of criminal law, on the other hand, is a 1990s phenomenon. And I feel that was like the last bulwark, the guardian of memory par excellence, the idea that law should protect the right way of commemorating certain events. And this is where the antennae really are, raised, because this is where you start worrying about state intervention or whatever intervention in the area of historical research and interpretation. So let me think about this some while longer, and perhaps I'll get back to you in a couple of weeks' time, having, reflected on the point that you rightly make. Do you have an opinion on this? Do you have another, what do you feel about it?
I think that insofar as I've looked at this, I've looked at it in the early 21st century and in the UK, and I think something very particular happens in the UK with the introduction of Holocaust Memorial Day and Holocaust education in schools, and something happens which I think relates to what you were talking about, but doesn't quite, but perhaps falls between, which is the emphasis on the Nazi genocide as something which was a matter of individual choice. Children in schools are, the lesson for children in schools is not to be a bystander, and one can see a point in teaching that moral lesson, but something which gets lost from that is that this was a state genocide. Yes. And so the possibility of so the end result of that is that in this country we end up with a government which both gives a lot of financial support to Holocaust memorialization, and at the same time institutes a hostile environment for people who are actually British citizens. And so the capacity of the Holocaust to produce a critique of the state is lost in that process of privatization, which I think touches on a number of the different themes that you spoke about, but this isn't my paper. And Louise London has a question or a comment. So Louise, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Right. Yes?
Yes, I can hear you.
So thank you. That was fascinating and very thought-provoking. And it's good to follow David, because I think what I want to say, which is particularly about Britain, sort of connects with it, which is the peculiar situation that the history of the British response to the persecution of Jews and the Holocaust has been written. There's more to write. I wrote some of it. But what is very odd is the feeling, the realization that you can dismantle the myths about the British response to your satisfaction and that of others, but actually the myth is still there. And that makes one wonder what should be done. I mean, I think in particular, David Cameron, our former Prime Minister, in his push for a Holocaust memorial, emphasized that the importance of this was to do with British values, which was somehow reflected in the British response. And so you get this simultaneous situation of a exploration and celebration of history, and of the victims of the Holocaust, but the fact that the bystanders were, as David was talking about, this bystander thing, it's not just about individuals, it's about governments. And somehow that gets lost with all the Holocaust education in schools, not something I experienced because I'm too old, but yes, and I wonder, to come to a question, how the material that you've looked at in relation to other countries and their history has this peculiar sort of double think, illustrates that, and whether some countries are recognizing the problem.
Thank you. This is another hard question. So I feel that what I've been talking about is actually the Americanized, Europeanized, top-down, so-called cosmopolitan institutional memory of the Holocaust, which is a sort of a narrative construct that has been hollowed out of specific historical contents in order for it to be used and adapted to a variety of different situations and different histories. Obviously, each country has a different history vis-a-vis the Holocaust. And I speak from Italy, where it is quite obvious how this kind of evening out of, all the thornier parts of history, where the Italian implication was more obvious, was brought about by cosmopolitan memory. It was very useful to be able to identify with a narrative that had very little to say about Italian implication, political implication in those crimes, even more than the bystander government implications that you can refer to. And it has acted as a screen memory that has kind of erased all specific contents and specific responsibilities regarding, in my country, consensus towards fascism, for example. It's a subject that people don't talk about, and the Holocaust narrative helps people not to talk about it, not to tackle the question in a frontal way. So I suppose that each country adapts that general narrative to their own sensitivities, interests, and whatever the mainstream interest. And I do agree with the fact that the individual aspect of the narrative, which is obviously also in line with the spectacularization, Americanization of that memory, since it passes through the normal, ordinary channels of the culture industry, films and whatnot, is another source of problem, because yes, I can see how it prevents people from understanding the systemic nature of the phenomenon that they're talking about, the political aspects and whatever. I wonder whether this individualistic approach has something to do with a kind of, yes, with the rules of show business as well as everything else, and also with a kind of individualistic ethics that doesn't seem to take into account the fact that whatever happens always happens within the larger context. I have lots of trouble, for example, when I talk about these subjects with some American friends, because I feel that the questions that they ask reveal that they tend to have this individualistic idea very often about, it is a question of personal choices that people make, and when they talk about this phenomenon, and even when I try to explain my arguments, they seem to, some, not all of them obviously, but some of them seem to fail to dwell on the systemic aspects of all social and political processes. I don't know if I answered your first question. Again, David, your questions are hard. As far as Louise London's remarks and questions are concerned, now my question to you is, do you feel that memory can ever be self-critical? Because that is the problem. I think that history can be, used to dismantle myths. But apart from the German case, which is kind of different from all the others, how many collective memories, institutionalized collective memories, have ever acted as a tool for self-criticism within the country that is commemorating an event? I feel that the tendency is always to go back on the ordinary tracks of self-absolution or celebration. And this is why the cosmopolitan narrative has been so, according to me, easy to bend according to the various agendas that each country had.
Well, I don't want to go on at great length at all, but what you make me remember is an example that took place sometime earlier this year, where a British political figure of a conservative tinge said something on the BBC about the noble tradition, Britain's noble tradition, in relation to the acceptance of the Kindertransport children. And this was picked up by a journalist called Jonathan Friedland, who started doing stuff on Twitter in which he was citing historians, including David Cesarani and myself. And this led to some discussion, and he ended up writing an article in the Jewish Chronicle about it. And so it was a sort of little tussle on the margins, but what it showed is an unresolved narrative, which just sits there like a kind of wet blanket on top of understanding. So I'm not asking you to comment, but
no, I agree with you. I mean, I didn't know about this specific case, but I feel that that we are in agreement on this point.
Thank you, Louise. While we wait for others to marshal their thoughts, let me ask you something else, Valentina, which is in a sense to push you harder on the in a sense on the framing and the conclusion of your paper, of your talk, because it seems to me that the connection, I was very persuaded by the critique of memory practices that you gave. I was less clear at the end at the connection between them and the rise of the xenophobic right. I could see some affinities, and so it would be interesting perhaps to hear a bit more about what sort of a relationship you think there is, and pushing you a bit harder on that. The framing of the talk was in terms of authoritarianism. And I suppose I did wonder whether that term is doing too much work in the paper, in which it can refer to authoritarian regimes, authoritarian practices within liberal regimes, and also to practices of representation. And whether the term loses clarity when it's used in so many different ways.
Okay, thank you. So as far as the term is concerned, I can see your point. It has a specific sense, and that is not the one I'm referring to. I'm not saying that we live in totalitarian states, but I mean the term in a more generic way. I mean the fact that you actually the author I refer to in this case is Charles Peirce, the philosopher, who once distinguished between different methods of fixing beliefs. And scientific method, which he means in a large sense, is, I believe something because somebody can prove it to me, because there is, because that belief is fixed within a public system of rules of the game where you have to give evidence and somebody can discuss against your point and whatever, the historical method. And then one of the other methods is the method of authority, which is a question of fixing your belief simply because somebody tells you to. And this is what I mean by authoritarianism. You just believe things that somebody has told you to believe. Obviously, there is a semantic connection between this generic idea of authoritarianism and the more specific sense. But what gets me a bit scared in public discourse nowadays, I don't know what it's like in Britain, but definitely in Italy and elsewhere, it's becoming more and more that way, is that on certain sensitive issues, such as Holocaust memory, but not just that, the impression is that the space for dialectics and public debate on a scientific basis is shrinking, because there is a drift, and this is the authoritarian drift I'm talking about, whereby certain issues, you don't need proof, you don't need demonstrations, and you just can't say certain things because either there are laws that will prevent you from that, or even without the laws, you might have such a a huge reaction against you, and you will be immediately compared to Hitler and whatever, because at the end of the day, you get compared to that people just don't dare even speak their doubts about certain official or mainstream truths about the most sensitive issues. So this is what I mean by authoritarianism. And obviously, you expect this kind of attitude from the right, because this is what they do. I mean this is, even though nowadays extreme right-wing movements are always, representing themselves as the paladins of freedom of expression. I mean, there is total continuity between the idea of fixing your belief according to what somebody tells you to believe. I mean, there's nothing strange historically about that. It's far more, more of a problem when the champions of liberal democracies are telling you what to think using this kind of method. So to answer your other question, what are the links between the rise of the xenophobic right and commemorative practices, standard commemorative practices? Well, I obviously, as I said, I'm not suggesting that the return of the xenophobic right is attributable directly to the politics of memory. The causes are obviously far more complex, multi-layered, they're structural, they're economic, and it has to do with, also the failure of the progressive, left to tackle or deal with problems that are traditionally left-wing and whatever. So there are far many more problems to confront. But though there are no direct cause and effects between the two phenomena, I feel that there is an indirect link between the two, rather a dense network of links that are mostly invisible to the naked eye. And this is what I was trying to do, to try to start thinking about them, and interconnections that have involuntarily perhaps catalyzed those phenomena that the politics of memory were trying to combat. The most obvious thing is that a practical aspect is that it's enough for any right-wing leader such as Matteo Salvini or Giorgia Meloni or whoever in Italy or whoever you want to go to Yad Vashem or to the Holocaust Memorial Museum and to pay lip service to the fight against anti-Semitism, and perhaps even add that they are strong supporters of Israel, and that is enough. It's like a cleansing ceremony. Nobody can ever tell them anything anymore because this is it. But it's not just that. I mean, they can go back and decide to stigmatize whatever minority they want, and nobody can tell them that they're racist or anti-Semitism because they have done the right thing. But it's also a question of the victim-centered narrative, and we know how easy it is even for right-wing movements to represent themselves as the victims of some kind of general persecution. And in general, I feel that regardless of the intentions of their promoters, the policies and the rhetorics of memory operate in the same cultural climate. They move in the same rhetorical field as the one that where you can legitimately expect to find ultranationalists, and even though they move from different positions, but sometimes they legitimize themselves even through their apparent conflict. I know.
Thank you, Valentina. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and also Jan Rybak would like to ask a question. And I think it would be good if, because we're soon running out of time, if we take this together. There's a question in the chat from someone who calls herself Edegard, which I think you have sort of just answered. So are you saying there is a link between nationalism and days like Holocaust Day, for example? Then we have, and then a question from Rachel Blumenthal, who asks, are you saying that there is a connection between laws criminalizing Holocaust denial and laws in Eastern Europe limiting research and requiring historians to adopt the state narrative?
Yes.
And then just to close, Jan, would you like to ask your question?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would like to push back in a few fields. Thank you very much for that. So the first point that you made on the sacralization of memories and so on, I'm not sure like what historians you're reading, because the historians on the Holocaust that I'm reading are carefully weighing all kinds of evidence, including personal memory and documents from the archives and so on, contextualizing them all, weighing them, analyzing them in their as critical historical sources as all of them. So I don't see a process actually in which personal memories would for some reason have a super authoritative standing there also, so I'm not sure about that. And I would also like to push a bit on what you said a bit earlier, that like because of a national narrative and national supposed consensus on that one can't say certain things. And I think this is on sensitive issues. And I think this is quite problematic way to put it, because it does sound quite a bit like, as you rightly observed, those who are considering themselves to be victims of prohibition of supposed prohibition of free speech or something like that. And I think I'm not accusing you of that, but I think that exactly when we are criticizing that, we have to be very precise about what we are referring to there. And I'm not aware of any serious historian in the West, at least, being banned or discriminated or whatever for serious research on any matter. And finally, more in a perspective sense. So when this general universalist idea of Holocaust memory, what positive can we take from that? Because this is the forms of public memory that we have in so many countries, in a European context and so on. It's there, and I think, or I'm wondering what we as historians, but also as members of the public, can take positively from this idea of never again. What can we do with that to change our society, to protect minorities? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jan. But I want to make this clear. The target of my criticism and polemics were never historians. I mean, actually, I feel that I am on their side, well, as I'm saying these things, because obviously historians deal with many sources. They know how to deal with sources. They know that witness testimonies are precious, important sources, but they also know that witnesses are not always right. They can make mistakes and whatever. So this is not what I was talking about at all. I'm not saying that we should discard witness testimonies altogether. What I'm talking about is what is happening within public, non-specialist public discourse, what's happening in the institutional communications regarding commemoration, what people say. And after many years, decades, I should say, of studying these topics, I've been in schools, I've been taken part in many of these ceremonies. I know what the rhetoric is, at least in my country. And and this fetishization of witnesses is something that has nothing to do with the historical interpretation of witness accounts. It's got a lot to do with the way other people treat witnesses, as if they had they were like fragments taken from the event itself, from the traumatic event itself, as if there were no mediation, be it cognitive, be it cultural mediation between their accounts and living through the event itself, like nothing had happened in between. So what I'm talking about is the way these testimonies, these witness accounts are being treated within the sphere of popular culture and institutionalized communication. I think that should answer a part of your question at least. Regarding the fact that there are things that people cannot say, obviously I'm not saying that they will be taken to jail if they say certain things, but I'm talking about certain issues, and it's not just the Holocaust, but the Holocaust is a good example, but also some more recent thorniest issues that we have had to deal with in the past few years, in Italy at least, but I don't think it's just an Italian phenomenon. Certain ideas that I might totally disagree with, but that were circulating regarding the best way to deal with the COVID epidemics, regarding certain ideas that were against government choices, the government's choices in the policies and whatever, they were kind of, people were, bullied into not expressing these ideas because in Italy, people started using the word negationism, like as in Holocaust denial, negationism, to talk about COVID negationists, as if comparing them, whoever, it wasn't just the people who said that the virus didn't exist, it was also people who agreed with the fact that the virus exists, but disagreed with the government's choices, and they were kind of described as negationists by all the mainstream press. And this is something that makes me feel a bit wary about the direction that communication is taking, even though, I do totally disagree with these people, but I just feel that in a democratic society, within the boundaries of speech, there shouldn't be this kind of limitation, be it through law, be it through other forms of intimidation. I don't think it should be, I am against this. And I feel that it's strange when people use these rhetorical techniques in the name of liberal democratic values. That's all I was saying. So why should we remember, was your last question. Well, we should remember all, important central events. I'm not saying that we should not remember or commemorate. I was just describing the drift that this kind of way of remembering has taken in the past few years. I feel that we should always ask ourselves why we should remember and not take it for granted that remembering is a good thing per se. One of the things that I worry about is the fact that the Holocaust remembrance has become this kind of totem, and people don't even ask themselves why you should be remembering these events. It's right to remember and to do it in the proper way that people have told you to, and this is how you lose whatever contact with whatever lessons or learning or understanding that you might acquire through the study, more than remembering, I think, of such events, the critical study of such events, historical study of such events. I feel, this is my opinion, obviously.
Thank you, Valentina. Unfortunately, we have to draw things to a close now. Before I do, I'd just like to let people know that our next seminar will be on the 31st of October, when we have Ben Ratskoff speaking to the title, A Foul and Violent Orgy, James Baldwin on Holocaust Exceptionalism and Black Revolt. But back to today, I'd like to thank everyone for coming this lunchtime. Above all, I'd like to thank Valentina for engaging with our questions so fully, and above all for such a stimulating and provocative talk. Thank you very much indeed.